Nobody's trying to suppress you because we told you that this looks like an allusion to the Holocaust. He basically said people need a narrative in order for the world to make sense to them. Like, people hear the word privilege and it's like, oh, that's bad. But actually, we're in a capitalist society. Somebody has to have privilege. It's how you use it and whether you acknowledge it that really makes all the difference. Welcome back to It's That Deep, the podcast. I always do a little dance when I say It's That Deep, but welcome back to It's That Deep, the podcast. This is a podcast where everything is that deep, because people try and tell you that it's not, but it is. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 5. We've already done 5 episodes, which is crazy to me because it feels like I just started this yesterday. But yeah, this is episode 5 of It's That Deep, and this is going to be another round of stories, another round of conversations, another round of just really talking about what's happening in the news, but also what it is really telling us about who we are as people and as a society. So I hope you guys are good. I hope you're well. I hope you enjoyed the last episode. And we're going to jump right into this episode because we've got some really interesting topics to talk about. So I don't know where you're listening to this. I don't know what you're doing. I don't know if you're at work. I don't know if you're at the gym. I don't know what you're doing. But if you're able to, grab a cup of tea or some beverage of your choice and get comfortable, because we are going to talk about everything that has been happening in the news. So let's get started. Okay, I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to jump straight into my honourable picks for this week. And thank God they lean a bit more pop culture this week, which is something I was like, I need to get into because it's not everyday sad news. But these stories lean a bit more pop culture-y. And even though that is the case, like I always say, they still are able to provide like a wider commentary on the world as a whole, and that's what these 2 honorable stories do. So we're going to start with the Receipts podcast. In the words of Mariah Huck, should I bring the receipts? So the Receipts, if you don't know, like a podcast, one of the OGs of like UK black podcasting, and last year the 3rd member of the Receipts, Milena, tweeted, and she was basically like, yeah, after 7 years, it's been a good run, I'm leaving the show. And Twitter went into a frenzy. Everyone was like, yo, what's happening? Why is Milena going? And as we do as humans, everyone began to cast aspersions and, you know, hypothesize as to what it was that made Milena leave the show. Okay, I guess a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not like an OG Receipts listener. I couldn't be, because I was way too young to be listening to that when the show started. But I'm also not like a loyal, like diehard Receipts stan. But if I come across an episode, I will listen to it. And I've listened to quite a few of their episodes. However, I am a nosy bugger. And so when Audrey and Tolly came back, just as the 2 of them in this latest episode, I was like, absolutely, I'm going to listen because I'm nosy and I want to know what happened. So in their first episode back, Audrey and Tolly basically sat down and just spoke about what actually transpired and why Milena left the show, like what happened that resulted in Milena leaving the show. And as always, with anything I talk about on this podcast, I'm not necessarily interested in the event per se, more so about what the event can tell us. And I was listening to the explanation. Obviously, it's a really techie one because they were a friendship group, and people may feel like certain people took sides, and everyone has their own. I mean, I hate this phrase, but everyone has their own perception of the truth. I don't really know that that's really a true thing, if I'm being honest, but that's language that we use, right, when we talk about disagreements. Everyone has their version of the truth. But what I did find really interesting was something that Tolly T said in the middle of the episode. So in the episode, Tolly T basically said, people need a narrative in order for the world to make sense to them. They need a victim and they need a villain. And when she said that, a light bulb went off in my head at that moment, because it's so true. Like, no matter what your stance is on the Receipts, is Milena right, is Tolly right, like all of that aside, this idea that we place people in a victim role or a villain role in order to make sense of the world is really, really true. And if we rewind and if we look at the responses of people when the news dropped that Milena left, the evidence is there. Immediately, everybody went into victim and villain mode. So, like I said, people cast their aspersions and stuff, but the majority of the responses to Milena's leaving was, Tolly's a bully. Tolly must have done something. Tolly's the reason that there's a rift. And it's like the note that Milena had written had no allusion as to why she left. Now, she has clarified that there was a rift between her and Tolly, but before we get to that point, and before we got to that point, there was no explanation. There was no allusion to any sort of drama as to why. Like, there could have been 1,000 reasons why Milena left, but immediately people's minds go, well, Tolly's a bully. Tolly's the reason why she left. And of course, if you are like a diehard listener, there may be reasons as to why that would be your conclusion, but we also have to really appreciate that bias plays a role in how quick we are to cast aspersions in something like this. And I say biases because, and look, I know that majority of their listenership is young Black women, but actually young Black women are just as capable of having biases the same way anyone else is, and having those biases inform how they look at the world. So we're not exempt. But I do really think we should investigate why so many people immediately assigned, so to speak, Tolly to the role of bully and villain. Like, I really think there is something to be said about how we make sense of all of these situations by fitting people into these roles in our head. But as well as that, the role that bias plays in who we assign to what role. Because I think, you know, you look at someone like Tolly, she's louder, probably a bit more brash, probably a bit more set in her opinions than the rest of, you know, the girls. And so it's easier to place her in that villain role, in that villain context, because in our minds, that's what a villain looks like, right? And comparatively to Milena, she fits that mold better, but that could just be our biases at play. Like, nobody will ever really know what happened between the three of them, but I think there's something to be said about how quickly, you know, people were assigning blame and, you know, throwing out names like bullies, and there was no context, there was no real specific allusion as to what actually happened. Our biases just sort of came in and took over, and we were able to draw conclusions, and it's like, we're capable of having biases too. So for me, it was like, okay, cool, they've broken up, they're moving forward as just a twosome, that's great. But actually the crux of this issue, if we want to call it that, is that we are seeing how biases really inform how people react to one another, and this receipts drama is just pure evidence of that. Okay, so my next honorable mention is all about Skepta. You know, Mr. Boy Better Know, Joseph Adenuga. Skepta's one good looking man. Amen. That was intrusive thoughts are taking over. But it's all about Skepta. So last week, shall I say, Skepta dropped. So he's, after 5 years, dropping an album. He hasn't made music in some time, and he is obviously really excited about the rollout of this album, blah blah blah. And during the week, he dropped the artwork to one of the singles on the album. Now, the single is called Gas Me Up, in brackets Diligent. And I, you know, the artwork came out, and immediately, like most people, I looked at my phone and I was like, what is this? I was like, what is he serious? Because, okay, so if you don't know, it's probably floating around on the internet somewhere. The artwork is essentially the backs of multiple heads. They're bald heads, and they're all in something that looks like a uniform. And on the back of one of the heads, the words "Gas Me Up" is written or tattooed. And my friend sent it to me, and immediately I was like, oh, that's not. So he came out and was like, oh, wow, that was not my intention. This is actually inspired by skinheads. And this whole single is about my parents and when they came over here from Nigeria in the 80s, how they encountered skinheads and blah, blah, blah. And my first thought was just like, where is your PR team? Hello. Where Where is your publicist? Where are your social media relations, your public relations? Why are they nowhere to be found? Because to most people without context, that image looked like Jews on their way to a concentration camp. And in the time that we are in, so incredibly, I mean, what's the word? Tone deaf? Is that the word? It's not really the word. Just so offbeat, and for many people, that was our instant reaction. Some people looked at it and was like, oh, this is very clearly a reference to skinheads. I was not. I think this is one of those cases where it's just a bit of a blunder. Like, what he originally envisioned obviously did not translate to the masses, which is fine, myself included, but he apologized. And then a few hours later, I'm assuming, like, after having had time to reflect and think, he came back with a series of tweets, and he basically said, like, actually, I don't want to have my artwork policed, and something along the lines of, like, if I can't produce my own art the way I want to, I should quit music. And I found that response really interesting. I think it's really fascinating that he would use the word policed. Like, even his fans under the tweets were like, yeah, Skepta, do it for us, bro, you know, don't let them muzzle you, don't let the softies win, this is about suppression. And I think there's something to be said about accountability being framed as suppression, especially when it comes to artistry and the creatives and all of that stuff. Like, as much as I appreciate art, I appreciate creativity, nobody's trying to suppress you because we told you that this looks like an allusion to the Holocaust. It's just accountability. Let me be careful, this is not about Skepta specifically, but I do think his response represents artists in general, and I'm talking like comedians, content creators, musicians, like the whole load, everyone, because I think a lot of the times artists assume that because they're artists, they have a right to be offensive, or they have a right to be outrageous, or they have a right to offend people. And that's just simply not the case. You know, I think about, like, I remember KSI, the whole KSI drama, you know, where he used a slur in a Sidemen video last year. And again, a lot of the comments were like, oh my gosh, we can't even create content anymore. We can't even do things that make people laugh anymore. And it's like, yes, you're able to do that, but then there's also responsibility on you as a creator who has such a large audience to acknowledge when you miss the mark. And I think about the Kanyes of the world and how they are just so offensive and so outrageous. And I know offense is now like an objective term, and it's like, well, what is really offensive and whatnot. But, well, Kanye can just be really offensive, let's be honest. But I think there's something to be said about artists thinking that they're untouchable because they're artists. And realistically, if you were in a 9-to-5, or if you were sat in an office like everybody else, your work and the product of your hands, it's within the area of reproach. You are held to account for it. You are held to the fire for what you create, for what you produce, right? That's why we have standards. That's how we have bosses and managers and hierarchical structures. And so, as much as I believe in artistry, as much as I believe in creativity, we have to tread really carefully, to the point that anytime somebody critiques a piece of art, or, you know, hold somebody to account for something they think is offensive, we have to be careful to not frame it as suppression, because we can see what suppression is. Just look at North Korea, and that's not suppression, guys. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, that gave me a lot to think about. And again, it's not about Skepta specifically, but he's more so like the vehicle I'm using to sort of show that, at least for me, I've learned that a lot of artists and musicians and the like really hold themselves in high regard, as you should, to be honest, back your chat, you know, but they hold themselves in such high regard to the point that critique is suppression or muzzling or policing or whatever word you want to use it. And I just thought that's really interesting. Okay, let's get into our main story for this week, because my head is hot. I'm not even gonna lie, my head is hot. it's an ongoing story, and it's one I've spoken about before, and I can't lie, I will probably speak about again, because the issue of Israel and Palestine is, I mean, like, we are living in history right now. Do we get it? Do we really know that we're living in history right now? Like, people are going to read about this in the history books in 10 years, in 20 years. Yeah, and a lot of what I'm seeing is just really flabbergasting me at the moment. But I really want to talk about the case that South Africa launched against Israel at the UN International Court of Justice. So I want to say just before Christmas last year, South Africa launched their case against the state of Israel, and their main claim was that the state of Israel are committing genocide. Now, I spoke in the third episode of this podcast, in the 2023 Wrapped, the October portion, about actually why, on all counts, what Israel are doing to Palestine can be considered a genocide. So check that out if you want to. But the hearing started and ended last week on Thursday and Friday. On the first day of the hearing, we had arguments from South Africa as to what has been happening in Gaza, why these atrocities fall under the umbrella of genocide, and they brought evidence after evidence after evidence. There's TikTok videos, there's tweets, there's pictures. And then on Friday, the second day of the hearing, we heard from Israel. Now, if South Africa are able to prove that Israel are committing a genocide right now, then it would mean that Israel are in violation of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention. Ironically, this is really ironic, this was a convention that was created in response to the Holocaust. The irony of it all literally blows my mind. So, I mean, as I record, we're on day 2 of the proceedings, and the goal of it is for really the UN to come to a conclusion as quickly as possible, because obviously the goal is to stop the genocide if they're able to prove that it is that. But actually, the results of these hearings can take years, and even whatever the UN do rule, it's legally binding, but there's not really a way to enforce it. They made a ruling with the Russia and Ukraine conflict that Ukraine were to pull out and stop all military action, and Russia basically ignored it. So again, it's another techie one where, even if they are able to prove it, is anything really going to happen? But like I said, the goal of this podcast is not only to understand what's happening in these stories, but extract lessons and see what these stories are able to tell us about who we are as a world, as a society. And so that's really what I want to focus on. And I'm gonna go back to actually where we started this episode with the receipts. Now, I know it's what the heck does the receipts have to do with Israel and Gaza? But stick with me, it's gonna make sense. So like I said, I've been trying to follow the proceedings, and funnily enough, I'm seeing this real thing of citizen journalism that's really taken off in the case of this Israel-Palestine conflict. There's been so many TikToks, so many tweets of lawyers and people with legal expertise coming and breaking this down for people. I'm not saying that's the only way you should get your news. Please pick up a book, read an article. But I do find this theme of citizen journalism really, really, really interesting, and how in the absence of what I believe to be journalistic integrity, particularly on the part of, I can only speak for Britain, the British press, actually people are well, we have to be citizen journalists because nobody's presenting a balanced information. So that's my first thing. This theme of citizen journalism is really interesting, and it's really, this whole conflict has really birthed and pushed this idea of citizen journalism. But even going back to what we were talking about at the top of the episode with the receipts and this whole victim villain complex that we, whether we like it or not, live by in order to make sense of our world. And I think we're really seeing that play out in this conflict, but not only the conflict, how the world is responding to the conflict. This is a mentality, for better or for worse, that really governs our behavior on a personal level, in the situation of the receipts, but also on a global scale. This idea of binary, this is good, this is bad, she's wrong, he's right. Like, it really governs how we interact with people on a day-to-day basis, but also how we interact with what's happening on a global scale. And that's what we're really seeing play out here. So even with the court proceedings, like, I kid you not, I had to, like I said, I had to dig. Not as much as I had to dig for previous stories, but I'm talking like BBC News, The Guardian, major, terrestrial TV broadcasters were not showing the trial on day one. They just weren't. And even your broadsheet newspapers, there were no resources, there was no live stream, there was nothing to point the British public to the first day of the hearings when South Africa were making their case. But now that we're on day two, there's live stream, there's resources, there's tweets, there's analysis, there's all of these things from your broadcasters and your newspapers. And it's like, well, in the absence of South Africa's argument, we're not able to really form a conclusion as members of the British public. You've removed one element of the argument for us. And so by doing that, immediately what it forces us to do is to slot Israel into the victim category, because they're making their defense, right? A defense against an argument we haven't heard. And it slots South Africa in the victim position. That could be for many reasons. There's this really sinister entanglement between the British press, the British government, and I'm going to chuck the British monarchy in there too. Like, the way the three of those institutions work behind the scenes is very, very sinister, and I have been dying to talk about it. So I'm waiting for something to happen so we can really get into it. But that could be part of the reason why the reporting has shown up the way it is. For me, however, it boils primarily down to this issue of bias. And I say issue, but I actually think it's worth noting that bias is not a bad thing, depending on how you use it. Similar to privilege. Like, people hear the word privilege and it's like, oh, that's bad. But actually, we're in a capitalist society. Somebody has to have privilege. It's how you use it and whether you acknowledge it that really makes all the difference. But back to this thing of bias, it's not a bad thing if you use it correctly. And so I'm going to go as far as saying that actually South Africa, even in this instance, have bias. Like, they themselves are a nation who, most of them have been displaced. They've experienced these muddy human rights issues. They've experienced apartheid, and actually their bias and their experience in that case is what is causing them to lead the charge against Israel. That is not a bad thing. The president, I'm going to read it actually, because the president of South Africa made a statement which I think captures this so well. He said, as a people who once tasted the bitter fruit of dispossession, discrimination, racism, and state-sponsored violence, we are clear that we will stand on the right side of history. So there's a bias that's been formed there because they have an emotional connection to what's happening in Palestine, having had it happen to them, and they're using that for good. Now, the people who aren't using it for good, in my opinion, British government, British press. So, I mean, I've said the word bias like 10 billion times in this episode, but even as I'm speaking, like, the biggest takeaway for me is to not even really not criminalize. What's the word? Like, not to look at biases as a negative thing all the way. Like, the main thing is to investigate them and to understand where they come from and investigate if they have any place in whatever situation you're looking at, whether it is Israel and Palestine or it's the receipts, because biases literally infiltrate everything from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. I'm not going to bet my life on it, but I'm really confident in saying that biases inform how we respond to situations, how we react to people, how we interact with people. I'm really confident of that. And so, yeah, I would say my biggest takeaway for this episode is bias. Like, investigate your biases and whether they deserve the place in your life that you give them unknowingly. So, that got deep. That got deep towards the end. I mean, it's called It's That Deep. So that concludes episode 5 of It's That Deep. A lot of interesting themes came up for me this week. I'm telling you today, 2024, because we're only, as I record this, we're only 12 days into the year. Much is going to happen. So this is where you want to be. Why would you be anywhere else? I don't understand that. Can you answer me? Like, why would you want to be anywhere else? So much is going to happen in this year. I can literally feel it because so much has already happened. So this is the place you want to be. This is where you want to get all of the information. This is where, if you want like a really deeper understanding of what is happening in the world and what it's able to tell us about who we are, it's that Deep the Podcast. Listen on Spotify, listen on YouTube, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. And yeah, I'm ready to get back next week for the next round of stories. So I will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week.